Welcome to the economic engine of Rome. In this video, we learn about the economic crises of the Great Rome. Rome did not collapse because of a single invasion, a single emperor, or a single bad decision. Rome collapsed because a system that once made it the most powerful civilization on Earth slowly turned against itself. What makes Rome's story so important is not just that it failed, but how it failed, step by step over generations, in ways that felt necessary at the time. The Roman economy was not destroyed overnight. It was weakened, distorted, and finally, exhausted by its own success at its height. The Roman Empire controlled nearly 1/4 of the world's population and an even larger share of its wealth. From Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, Roman roads, laws, and currencies bound together territories that had once been completely independent. This scale of control created immense economic advantages. Taxes flowed inward. Resources moved efficiently. Trade expanded beyond anything the ancient world had seen before. Rome became rich not because it invented capitalism, but because it mastered extraction, administration, and force better than anyone else. The foundation of Rome's economy was conquest. Every new province meant land, slaves, metals, grain, and taxes. Military expansion was not just political strategy. It was economic policy. Victorious generals returned to Rome with gold, silver, artwork, and hundreds of thousands of enslaved people. These spoils were injected directly into the Roman economy, increasing wealth without increasing productivity. As long as Rome kept expanding, this system worked. When expansion slowed, the cracks began to appear. Slavery was the backbone of Roman production. Slave labor worked the farms, mines, workshops, and households of the empire. Large agricultural estates known as latifundia replaced small, independent farms. Wealthy elites bought land cheaply from citizens who could no longer compete with slave-run agriculture. Over time, free Roman farmers were pushed out of the economy that had once sustained them. This concentration of land and labor in elite hands increased short-term efficiency, but hollowed out the middle class. The very group that had once filled Rome's armies and stabilized its economy. Rome's monetary system initially reflected discipline and restraint. For centuries, Roman coins were reliable. The silver denarius, introduced during the Republic, maintained consistent purity and weight. Trust in Roman money allowed trade to flourish across vast distances. Merchants accepted Roman coins from one end of the empire to the other because they trusted the metal content, not just the emperor's face stamped on it. This trust was one of Rome's greatest economic achievements. But Rome's spending grew faster than its productive base. Maintaining legions across thousands of miles, building roads, aqueducts, temples, and public entertainment, and feeding massive urban populations required constant revenue. As long as conquests supplied fresh wealth, Rome could afford this. When expansion reached its limits in the 2nd century CE, Rome faced a problem it had never solved before. How to pay for an empire that was no longer growing? The city of Rome itself became economically distorted. Over 1 million people lived in the capital at its peak, most of whom produced little of tangible value. The state distributed free or subsidized grain to hundreds of thousands of citizens through the annona system. This policy maintained social stability but placed enormous strain on imperial finances. Grain had to be transported from North Africa and Egypt, stored, protected, and distributed all at state expense. Rome was feeding its population not because it was economically efficient, but because it feared unrest. Wealth inequality widened dramatically. A small, elite-controlled land, political power, and capital, while the majority lived on the edge of subsistence. This inequality was not accidental. It was structurally embedded. Senators were forbidden from engaging in commerce, yet they controlled land and credit indirectly through freedmen and proxies. The laws were written to protect property, not opportunity. Economic mobility declined, and resentment grew beneath the surface of Roman society. Taxation, once light and indirect, became heavier and more complex. Provinces were expected to fund not only their own administration, but also the military and urban populations elsewhere. Tax collection was often outsourced to private contractors, who squeezed local populations for profit. Over time, taxes increased, not because Rome became more efficient, but because it became more desperate. This pushed farmers off their land and reduced long-term productivity. Rome's economy was impressive, but it was fragile. It depended on constant inflows of resources, political stability, and military dominance. It lacked mechanisms for innovation, efficiency gains, or sustainable growth. When external pressures increased and internal discipline weakened, the system had no margin for error. What followed was not sudden collapse, but a slow transformation from prosperity to stagnation. By the 3rd century CE, Rome faced inflation. Labor shortages, declining trade, and rising military costs, symptoms of deeper structural failure. The empire responded not by reforming its foundations, but by attempting to control outcomes through laws, price caps, and currency manipulation. These choices did not solve the problem, accelerated it. Rome did not destroy its economy because it was ignorant. It destroyed it because the incentives that once created success now rewarded short-term survival over long-term stability. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a trap. And this is where Rome's real story begins, not with barbarians at the gates, but with an economy that could no longer support the civilization built upon it. Now we will discuss about the CUR and CY debasement and the death of TRUST when Rome could no longer expand. It faced a problem every empire eventually confronts: expenses that kept rising while real sources of wealth stopped growing. The Roman state did not reduce its military, shrink its bureaucracy, or cut public spending. Instead, it chose the path that felt least painful in the short term and most destructive in the long term. It began to manipulate its money. For centuries, Roman currency had been stable. The silver denarius was trusted across the empire because it contained a predictable amount of silver. That trust allowed trade to function without constant negotiation or inspection. But stability depended on discipline, and discipline began to erode when emperors faced pressure to pay soldiers, officials, and suppliers without sufficient revenue. The first signs of debasement appeared during the reign of Nero in the 1st century CE. The silver content of the denarius was slightly reduced, not enough for most people to notice immediately. This reduction allowed the state to mint more coins using the same amount of silver. In effect, Rome was creating more money without creating more value. At first, this seemed harmless. The economy continued to function, and the empire remained strong. But a dangerous precedent had been set. Once the state learned it could solve financial problems by weakening its currency, it became increasingly difficult to stop. Each new emperor faced the same pressures. The army demanded higher pay. Public expectations increased, and political instability made loyalty expensive. Instead of raising taxes aggressively or reducing spending, emperors turned again and again to the mint. By the 2nd century CE, debasement accelerated. The silver content of the denarius declined steadily. Under Emperor Commodus's purity dropped. Further, by the time of Septimius Severus, the coin contained significantly less silver than it once had. Soldiers were paid more in nominal terms, but the real value of their wages declined. This created a cycle in which higher pay demands led to further debasement, which led to higher prices, which led to even higher pay demands. Inflation followed naturally. Prices rose not because merchants were greedy, but because money itself was losing value. When more coins chased the same amount of goods, prices adjusted upward. This effect was not evenly distributed. Urban populations and soldiers felt the impact quickly, while rural areas experienced shortages and barter became more common. Trust in money began to fracture. As confidence in currency declined, people responded rationally. Those who could hoarded older, purer coins. Newer coins were spent quickly, while older coins were saved or melted down. This behavior, later described as Gresham's law, meant that bad money drove out good, the very act of debasement. Removed high-quality currency from circulation, leaving only inferior coins in everyday use. Trade suffered. Long-distance commerce depends on reliable units of exchange. Merchants became hesitant to accept payment in debased coinage without adjusting prices constantly. Transaction costs increased. Markets became less efficient. In some regions, trade reverted to barter or payments in kind. Rome's once integrated economy began to fragment. The 3rd century CE marked a turning point. Political instability exploded. Emperors rose and fell rapidly, often through violence. Each new ruler needed immediate legitimacy, and the fastest way to buy loyalty was through money, especially military pay. The result was extreme debasement. New coins, such as the Antoninianus, were issued with silver content so low that they were essentially bronze coins washed in silver. Inflation spiraled. Contemporary sources describe prices multiplying many times over within a single generation. Wages failed to keep up. Savings were destroyed. Fixed incomes became worthless. Trust in money, once one of Rome's greatest strengths, was shattered. The Roman state attempted to respond through control rather than reform. Instead of restoring currency integrity, emperors imposed price controls and wage regulations. The most famous example was Emperor Diocletian's edict on maximum prices in 301 CE. This sweeping law attempted to cap prices for hundreds of goods and services across the empire. The edict failed. Prices did not fall, goods disappeared. Withdrew from markets rather than sell at losses. Black markets flourished. Enforcement required brutal punishments, which further discouraged trade. The edict was quietly abandoned, leaving behind a weakened economy and a population even more distrustful of the state. Meanwhile, taxation increased sharply. As inflation eroded monetary revenue, the state demanded payment in goods instead of money. Farmers were required to deliver grain, oil, and livestock directly to the government. This system, known as taxation in kind, reduced flexibility and discouraged surplus production. Farmers produced only what they needed to survive and meet obligations. Economic dynamism vanished. To stabilize revenue, professions were made hereditary. Sons were legally bound to follow their father's occupations. Farmers were tied to their land. Bakers could not leave their trade. Tax collectors were trapped in their roles. These measures reduced mobility and innovation, transforming Roman society from a dynamic economy into a rigid, controlled system. Money, once a tool of exchange and growth, became a symbol of state failure. People trusted land, food, and personal networks more than currency. Economic activity became local, defensive, and survival-oriented. The empire still existed politically, but economically it had regressed. The damage caused by debasement was not just financial, it was psychological. Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. Even when later emperors attempted currency reform, confidence did not fully return. The memory of inflation lingered. People adjusted their behavior permanently, prioritizing security over opportunity. Rome's leaders did not intend to destroy their economy. They were responding to immediate crises with tools that seemed effective at the time. But by choosing monetary manipulation over structural reform, they undermined the very foundation of economic life. Money stopped being a neutral medium and became a weapon of survival. This is the core lesson of Rome's monetary collapse. Inflation is not just rising prices. It is the gradual erosion of trust between the state and its people. Once that trust disappears, laws become harder to enforce, markets shrink, and social cohesion weakens. By the end of the 3rd century, Rome had lost control of its economic narrative. The empire still had armies, laws, and emperors, but it no longer had a functioning monetary system capable of supporting its scale. What followed was not recovery, but adaptation to decline, and with that decline came deeper transformations in labor, land ownership, and social structure changes that would permanently alter the Roman world. Now we will discuss about taxatio and labor collapse, and the destruction of productivity of Rome as Rome's monetary system weakened and inflation destroyed confidence in currency, the state turned to the only resource it could still control directly: people and land. The imperial government did not solve its financial problems by restoring productivity or reducing costs. Instead, it intensified extraction. What followed was not simply higher taxes, but a transformation of Roman society into a rigid system designed to guarantee revenue at any cost. Taxation in the early Roman Republic had been relatively light and irregular. Citizens were taxed primarily during wartime, and provinces contributed based on their capacity. By the late Empire, taxation had become constant, detailed, and relentless. The state needed to fund a massive standing army, a bloated bureaucracy, public grain distributions, and imperial infrastructure. Every failure in the economy was answered with higher demands, because money had lost reliability. Taxes were increasingly collected in kind. Farmers were required to deliver fixed quantities of grain, oil, wine, livestock, and other goods directly to state storehouses. These obligations did not adjust easily to bad harvests, natural disasters, or local conditions. When farmers failed to meet quotas, they faced punishment, confiscation of land, or forced labor. Small landowners suffered the most. Many could no longer produce enough to satisfy both state demands and personal survival. As debts accumulated, they sold their land to wealthy elites or abandoned it entirely. Large estates expanded, while independent farmers disappeared. The countryside slowly emptied of free producers, weakening the agricultural base that had sustained Rome for centuries. To prevent further collapse, the state imposed controls that worsened the situation. Farmers were legally bound to their land. Leaving without permission became a crime. These farmers, known later as coloni, were not slaves, but they were no longer free. They could not change occupations, relocate, or negotiate obligations. Their status marked the transition from a free rural population to a semi-serf class, tied permanently to production for the state and elites. Urban labor collapsed as well. Craftsmen, bakers, shipbuilders, and merchants faced price controls, compulsory service, and mandatory production quotas. Professions became hereditary. A son was legally required to follow his father's trade, regardless of skill or opportunity. These policies ensured continuity of supply, but destroyed innovation, efficiency, and motivation. The Roman labor system had once thrived on flexibility. Free workers moved where opportunities existed. Slaves were integrated into productive roles. Markets adjusted naturally. Under imperial controls, labor became frozen. Economic life lost its ability to adapt. Productivity stagnated not because Romans forgot how to work, but because the system punished initiative. Large landowners benefited from this arrangement. With political influence and legal protection, they absorbed smaller properties and negotiated tax exemptions. Wealth concentrated further at the top, while the state extracted relentlessly from those with the least power. This imbalance reduced overall output. Empire grew poorer, even as demands increased. Trade networks deteriorated. Roads and ports still existed, but fewer goods moved across them. Long-distance trade declined as local production focused on survival rather than surplus. Cities shrank. Markets became regional rather than imperial. Economic specialization, one of Rome's greatest strengths, faded. The army, once filled by citizen farmers, now relied increasingly on mercenaries and recruits from outside Roman society. This shift was not only military, but economic. Citizens could no longer afford to leave farms that barely met tax obligations. Military service became a burden rather than an honor, weakening loyalty and discipline. Corruption flourished. Tax collectors abused their authority. Officials extorted producers. Laws became tools of extraction rather than justice. The cost of administration rose as trust declined. More enforcement was needed to maintain the same level of control further. Draining resources, Rome responded to falling productivity with more control, not reform. Instead of reducing obligations to encourage output, the state tightened them. This created a vicious cycle. Lower productivity led to higher demands, which led to even lower productivity. The economy entered a downward spiral. What made this collapse so devastating was its permanence. Once labor was bound, land consolidated, and markets suppressed, recovery became nearly impossible. Economic systems depend on trust, incentives, and freedom of movement. Rome had removed all three. By the late Empire, the economy no longer functioned to create wealth. It functioned to prevent collapse, and even that goal was slipping away. The state survived by consuming its own foundation, draining future capacity to meet present needs. Rome had not been conquered economically by outsiders. It had conquered itself through policies that prioritized control over vitality. The empire still existed in name, but its economic heart was failing. This transformation did not happen suddenly. It unfolded over generations, each decision justified by crisis, each reform designed to stabilize the present while sacrificing the future. By the time the consequences were visible, the system was locked in place. The Roman economy did not die. It hardened, ossified, and lost the ability to sustain a complex civilization. What followed was not an immediate collapse, but a long decline into a simpler, poorer world. And as the economy failed, so did Rome's ability to respond to external threats, not because enemies became stronger, but because Rome became weaker from within.